as we should do with the national anthem, because this year is, of course, the 100th wedding anniversary of Qaid Azam and his wife Rati Jinnah, who were married in 1918. Also, happy birthday to the subject of our discussion this morning, and that is Aurangzeb, who was born in 1618, 400 years ago exactly. This morning, I have the privilege of interacting with Audrey Truschke, who is the assistant professor of history at Rutgers University. Her field is Mughal history, and her first book, Cultures of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court, relates to the interaction and influences between the Sanskrit and the Persian-speaking Muslim world throughout the 15th and 16th centuries. One has to putting that in its context, that first book, one has to remember that many of the manuscripts, the Hindu and the sacred manuscripts, such as the Mahabharata, such as the Ramayana, were in fact translated at the court, and they were regarded with as much reverence as the Holy Quran was by the Muslim rulers themselves. Audrey's book, Aurangzeb, The Man and the Myth, by its very title, prepares us for an unusual biography that separates the man from the myth. It's almost as if over the centuries, layers have coated the figure of Aurangzeb. Layers of misinformation, misrepresentation, folklore, and at times, downright lies. Audrey has done a superb job in scrubbing away the accretions, hosing down the half-truths, and allowing us to see the man behind the reputation. If I was to describe Aurangzeb as, in fact, I'm tempted to describe the Qaid, he's a much maligned Muslim monster in the eyes of the West. And it's really to disabuse that notion that this book is of such primeval, I'll say primeval because this is the first of the independent assessments, and in fact in this case a reassessment of Aurangzeb. And it's particularly important, as I've said, that we should be talking about it since it's 400 years since he was born. Audrey's book is an accessible biography. It targets the prejudiced reader, those prejudiced against Aurangzeb, who regarded him as a narrow-minded Muslim zealot, and those who were prejudiced in his favor, as the one Mughal who asserted the cause of Islam over a country populated largely by infidels. Of the four major Mughals, the six great Mughals, Aurangzeb, like his great-grandfather Akbar, had been one of the longest rulers amongst his dynasty. Well, who was Aurangzeb, and how much of his reputation is grounded in fact, and how much floats on a morass of misinformation? So, Audrey, over to you. Who was this man, and how can we separate him from this unfortunate myth that has been built around him? Please, just a quick synopsis of his life, etc.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And let me first say that it is a pleasure to be here with all of you at the Lahore Literary Festival. It is a special pleasure to be speaking about Aurangzeb in Lahore, right? I live in the United States, I'm used to speaking in New York, and it's to be in Lahore. Who was Aurangzeb? That's a really hard question, and it's hard because we have to go through so much to get back to him, right? We're in 2018, and we can't do anything about being in the present. You must work through your present and everybody else's past to get back to the Mughal past. That means working through Pakistani and Indian nationalisms. It means working through the colonial past, and British colonialists had very specific agendas in maligning Aurangzeb Alamgir. And then, of course, we have to work back through the Mughal sources. Mughal sources they're not straightforward, right? Written history is never straightforward. They had their own agendas. So who was Aurangzeb? He was a prince first. Later, he became king. He became king on his own wits, fighting against his three brothers, killing two of them. He would have killed the third if he could have gotten his hands on the guy. And then he became king of Hindustan, and he grew his empire to an unprecedented extent. And by the end of his life in 1707, Aurangzeb's empire was the largest that South Asia had ever seen. It was roughly the size of modern-day India, although slightly different geographically. Aurangzeb is an enigma, and he remains an enigma to me even after writing this book, and that's partly because he seems a sort of combination of contrasts. He grew the Mughal Empire to its greatest extent in history. By that measure, he was the most successful, arguably, of the Mughal kings, and yet he is usually blamed for the entire thing shattering in the few decades following his death. He's widely thought to have been more pious than his predecessors, and indeed, by many conventional measures, Aurangzeb appears to have taken his religion, Islam, fairly seriously. And yet, if you dig a little bit deeper, he also employed more Hindus than any other Mughal king, including Akbar, by a significant margin. And his Islam was also a talismanic and Sufi, sort of inflected Islam. It's hard to figure out Aurangzeb Alamgir, and yet I am committed to trying because, in my opinion, he remains one of the keys to understanding the 17th and the 18th centuries in South Asia. This crucial moment when the Mughal Empire grows to its greatest extent, and then suddenly, like that almost, seems to just shatter entirely, paving the way for the long 18th century and the rise of regional powers, and eventually for colonialism.
Aurangzeb, as you rightly mentioned, and we give the picture on the left of Aurangzeb with his brothers sitting with their father, Shah Jahan. In your book, you've dealt with Aurangzeb's life in 4 phases, so I'll deal with them in the same chronology. The first 4 phases, just to anticipate your appetite, is at whet it. It's the first phase was as a prince. Then the second phase is when he's sent out as an emissary, in fact, as a governor on behalf of his father. Then the next is when he's fighting for supremacy, takes over and is the king. And the last phase is when the years that he spends in the Deccan. I'll deal with the first phase. He was educated in Hindi, Persian, Brij Bhasha, and which is a translation of the Sanskrit, and was familiar with the Sanskrit translation of the Ramayana and Mahabharata. And at the age of 14, there is this particular incident that takes place. Would you like to narrate it?
Please. So this is the elephant fight. So what happened was Shah Jahan, who was king, called for an elephant fight. This was a sort of normal royal pastime. So 2 elephants were called Sudhakar and Surat Sundar. Mughal elephants very often have Hindi names. They were fighting one another, and one of the elephants, I believe Sudhakar, although I have to look that up, went mad. Right, so when an elephant goes mad, that's a very dangerous thing, right? So the elephant turned on the royal family, possibly threatening even Shah Jahan and his son's lives. Dara Shikoh was there, the eldest son and Shah Jahan's favorite, but he didn't do anything. Okay, Dara was not one to seek out conflict, it seems, at least at this point. Rather, Aurangzeb stepped up to the plate, the third son, and not his father's favorite. And Aurangzeb sort of wielded this spear and sort of fought off the royal elephant, and he ended up driving the spear through the elephant's head and through his skull. Right? He didn't kill the elephant, but then the elephant was sort of shaken out of its madness, one might say, and drawn back into the fight, and everybody was safe. And so you can see Prince Aurangzeb here, right, a young teenager, sort of standing up to this mad animal. In the chronicles from Shah Jahan's reign, one of Shah Jahan's historians parallels this to Shah Jahan's feat of facing up to a raging lion in 1610. Shah Jahan was, of course, not Shah Jahan then, right? He was a prince. And he had done that in 1610 while his father, Jahangir, watched. So you have this parallel for a moment, right, of the son Aurangzeb with his father Shah Jahan, with the son Shah Jahan and his father Jahangir, right, where the two appear to be engaged in a similar activity. This moment, however, of Shah Jahan seeing Aurangzeb in his own royal image was not to last for Aurangzeb, however, and Dara Shikoh quickly regained his place, if he had ever lost it, as the favorite.
Despite the drama of it, it didn't have a lasting effect on the father-son relationship, as we'll discover in a few moments. The second phase is when he is as one of the young princes, and this is a very famous painting in which you see him with Shashida and Murad Baksh, and they're riding. And this particular picture was in fact adapted by has been adapted by various artists here as such. In the second phase, he's posted to both Gujarat, and the Deccan. And during this time, by this time he's what, 1635, makes him 17 years old, he falls in love, surprise, surprise, with a courtesan. And her name was Hirabai Zainabadi. They have this rip-roaring affair where he walks into the garden and he sees her, is enamored of her. They become lovers, and then she was plucking mangoes from, I think, a tree. And he falls in love with her, and they have this affair which lasts, alas, a year, after which she dies. Then, prudently, they get him married off, and that's his first marriage in 1637, when he's age 19. During this time, he's being posted to different positions of responsibility, in a sense, I would say, being prepared for not kingship, but certainly for viceroyaltyship, if I may say. Would that be right?
I guess I would put it a little bit differently. So, Mughal succession practices did not follow primogeniture, right? There was no assumption that the eldest son would inherit the throne. That's a European idea. It's not a Mughal idea. And so, the way that this worked was that all sons had equal claim to their father's throne, and they fought until the last man was left standing. The war of succession between Aurangzeb and his three brothers was notably long, and it was notably bloody, but the fact itself was inevitable. Right? Shah Jahan did favor Dara Shikoh, and he did want Dara Shikoh to assume the throne, but everybody knew that that was not Shah Jahan's decision to make, right? And it was normal for Mughal kings to send their sons out across the empire so that they could build their military skills, they could engage in combat, so that they could get to know the empire that they might one day rule, and so crucially that they could develop alliances with old groups who had supported the Mughals for decades, and alliances with new groups that needed to be brought into the Mughal fold. So Aurangzeb was being well prepared to fight in the War of Succession. Ironically, because Shah Jahan favored Dara Shikoh, he tended to keep Dara close at court, right? So while Aurangzeb was hardening himself on the battlefield, Dara Shikoh was sort of laying around in Lahore and Agra and Delhi and, translating the Upanishads, and that's wonderful, but it didn't really prepare him for the nitty-gritty of being a Mughal king, right? Being a Mughal king involved a lot in terms of cultural exchange, but you did have to be able to hold power first in a military sense. So ironically, because Shah Jahan wanted Dara Shikoh close, he arguably did not give Dara the opportunities that he needed to become best suited to succeed the throne of Hindustan. The other thing that I'll comment on is, during these 22 years when Aurangzeb is sort of shuttling across the Mughal Empire, right? His movements are basically carving out the sort of most outlying areas. During this time, you do have these sort of softer moments, right? He falls in love with a Hindu woman, with a musician, right? Hirabai. We don't think of love when we think of Aurangzeb. We tend not to think of Hindus either, except in a negative sense, and we don't think of music except insofar as he is thought to have banned music, which is a mischaracterization of his policies. And yet, there you have it, right? He falls in love with a Hindu musician. It only lasts a year, right? We're not really sure what Hirabai died of. Natural causes are the general explanation, although more fanciful versions imagine poisoning or something like that, right? We can't prove any of that. But we do have this moment where he falls in love. And this is not something that just happens in Aurangzeb's youth, right? And that's important to emphasize, right? Sometimes people have this vision of a sort of joyful young prince, and then he became hardened in the War of Succession and sort of became this increasing Islamist figure. I think that is incorrect. Even at the very end of his life, in the first decade of the 18th century, right, in the 1700s, Aurangzeb spends his final years in the company of Udaipuri, another Hindu woman, and another musician, right? So his life, in a sense, is sort of punctuated by these love affairs. There is a softer side to the king, if one that is hard to access through official chronicles.
Good. Now, we reach Aurangzeb's age. He's now 39 when he's brought back, and then for the next 24 years, they begin with the tumultuous wars of succession between him and his brothers. 1657, Shah Jahan falls ill, and then there's this fratricidal struggle between the four sons. And The relationship of the siblings and with their father, and father with the children, reminded one very much of what was called the Guelph syndrome. With the Hanoverians, they hated the princes of Wales. All of them. They hated them because they saw the Prince of Wales as a living symbol of their own mortality. That they're waiting for them to die, and that is why the man they were suspicious of the Princes of Wales. And the same thing applies in a sense here. It was this kind of Hanoverian thing, but he had no such scruples. Aurangzeb, and you mentioned the phrase here, a wolf thirsting for the blood of his brothers.
Correct. That is a direct quote.
That's a direct quote, indeed. Dara Shikoh, now I'll just deal with very quickly and we'll cover the brothers. Dara Shikoh flees to Lahore, Multan. Dara Shikoh, Sufi by temperament, soft-spoken, a wonderful aesthete. He had presented this beautiful album to his wife, Nadra Begum, and was besotted by her, and sensibly so. But he was more concerned with the kingdom of heaven, not with the kingdom on earth, whereas Aurangzeb was much more pragmatic. Dara Shikoh is chased, captured by Mughal Emperor, and then eliminated by Aurangzeb. Shah Jahan, the other brother, flees to Dhaka and then Burma. Murad Baksh, he's invited to a party, made drunk, arrested and put in chains. And then the ultimate act of patricide is where Aurangzeb imprisons his father in Agra fort and leaves him, strips him of all his power, of all his jewels, etc., even to the pearl rosary that was his favorite, and attempts to get that from him. Then there is if you could comment, because this is something which I have not come across and which was fascinating in your book, and that is the role of the sisters in their alignments with each brother in this war of succession. We have Jahara, who goes for whom? Who supports whom?
What, Dara, right? Yeah.
Dara, absolutely. And then Roshanara supports Aurangzeb, and Murad supports Murad. And it's interesting that in the end, it is Gauhara who's in fact living with him towards the end. There is then the battle of Samugra and his coronation. So could you just touch upon the coronation?
Okay, let me say first a few things on the War of Succession.
Yeah, please.
So, as I said before, the War of Succession was a foregone conclusion that it would happen. The only two questions were when and who would win. Those were the questions. The War of Succession, it happened in 1657 because Shah Jahan fell ill, right? And he was quite ill. He was at death's doorstep, and his sons assumed he would die. Okay, when Shah Jahan doesn't die, that is a big problem. Okay, but first, it was clear Shah Jahan would live a few months in probably, but Aurangzeb had to deal with his brothers, right? And if you appreciate sort of military tactics and intrigues and diplomacy, right? I mean, the War of Succession is like the pinnacle of all of that put together, right? I mean, Aurangzeb is pretty incredible throughout that and how he manages everyone, right? He plays the brothers off of one another, he involves the sisters, and he comes out as the victor. And I would underscore that the point of these succession crises, right? For decades, scholars thought that these weakened the Mughal state. They thought that they were a problem, a bad thing, right? A sign of the inferiority of the Mughals in comparison to European succession practices. More recently, scholars have rethought that, particularly Munis Faruqi at Berkeley. And I'm very convinced by his arguments that the wars of succession between the Mughal princes were essential to the health of the Mughal Empire, right? They allowed new alliances, new groups to be brought into the empire, and crucially, they allowed the best man for the job to rise to the top, right? We don't have to like Aurangzeb, you don't have to endorse him or anything he did, but he was best suited to become Mughal emperor, right? The war worked in this sense. Once Aurangzeb became king, of course, he integrated all of the networks basically forged by his brothers without reprisals, right? And this is a crucial aspect that allowed these succession struggles to succeed. So if you had supported Murad in the War of Succession, you were not automatically imprisoned and executed or anything like that. Murad was executed, but his supporters were just integrated into the royal household. There was sort of no issue there, right? let me say something briefly on Shah Jahan. So when the dust of conflict cleared in 1659, Aurangzeb's ready to hold his second of two coronations, and Shah Jahan is still alive. This is very inconvenient. Okay, Shah Jahan is supposed to be dead by this point. That's why the War of Succession started. It was not a rebellion. They thought he was going to die. And so now he's alive. And this was a big problem for Aurangzeb because there was basic agreement across the Mughal Empire and across the wider Islamic world, covering much of Asia, that to overthrow one's father, the reigning king, was against Sharia. All right? And Aurangzeb cared. He cared about Sharia, perhaps personally, but certainly as a king. He wanted to be perceived as a sort of, legitimate Islamic ruler. So it was a problem that Shah Jahan lived, and Shah Jahan lived another 7.5 years, locked away in Agra's Red Fort. Some say, whimsically, with a beautiful view of his Taj Mahal, right, where Mumtaz is buried, until he died of natural causes. During that period, many people viewed Aurangzeb as an illegitimate king, including Shah Jahan's chief Ghazi, right, the chief religious figure in the Mughal Empire. Aurangzeb had to fire him and hire a different guy, whose main qualification was that he would endorse Aurangzeb as a legitimate king despite the Sharia issues. So that was a problem for Aurangzeb, and it sort of plagued him throughout his first decade of rule. To comment briefly on the coronation. So Aurangzeb had two coronations. He had a sort of rushed coronation in 1658. That's usually what this image is thought to be of. Right? And it was rushed because he was in the middle of the War of Succession. Dara was on the run. He was about to go after him. Very few people were present. A lot of the sort of accoutrements of a normal Mughal coronation were foregone, right? The khutbah was not read in his name, the coins weren't struck, right? They delayed all of that until the bigger coronation in 1659. That was a true lavish Mughal coronation, right? All the merchants made out like bandits, the Mughals bought so much stuff, right? I mean, it was grand on a scale never before seen in India. And I think that these two coronation ceremonies, to me, they sort of embody two different poles of Aurangzeb Alamgir, right? On the one hand, he has moments where he appears almost simple, right? Almost a simple, austere guy. And yet he participated, and in many ways you could argue perfected, and certainly embodied Mughal kingship at its finest, right? With all the toppings.
Mm-hmm. Now, we are a little more civilized here, in that the War of Succession between our brothers is done very discreetly.
Let me not comment on that.
Okay. Aurangzeb becomes the king, and he's king for 24 years from Delhi. Remains in Delhi, he's controlling the empire from Delhi, and I'd like to just touch upon, because we're in the Punjab, and that is his present, the stamp that he creates through, for example, like the Badshahi Mosque. Here, to me, I think that is probably the quintessential difference between Aurangzeb as a ruler and a builder and his father. The father builds a monument to Aurangzeb's mother, as she was, Mumtaz's mother was, builds a monument to her. Costs a fortune, but it's for single occupancy. Aurangzeb builds two mosques in Delhi, and also the one here in 1673-74, and they could be filled by the entire population of the old city at the time. So you could have had almost 30,000 Aurangzebs praying in the Badshahi Mosque. And I think this is it's a telling indication of his mind, where it was not him. When you go to the mosque, you won't see his name there, but you will see the name of the man, Fidai Khan, who in fact completed the mosque. So I think there is a kind of self-abnegation, a subservience of himself, subordination of himself as such. So in the 24 years, what about the Punjab? What was his position? What was his interaction with the Punjab?
So, the first 24 years of Aurangzeb's reign, right, largely, I won't say unexceptional, but sort of in the sort of standard style of Mughal kingship, right? He's in Delhi, he's in Agra, he comes through Lahore, he goes to Kashmir for vacation, right? Sort of nothing changes that drastically, right? He does make some alterations to Mughal court rituals, right? He's not so keen on music after a while personally, right? Things like that. In terms of the Punjab, I would say that, we've sort of had issues going on. The Mughals had issues going on in the Punjab. The Sikhs were certainly starting to rise up. Let me rephrase that. The Sikhs had been plaguing Mughal interests for several decades, right? And this was an armed conflict. Perhaps one of the more notable things that happened is the capture of Guru Tegh Bahadur and his execution in 1675. And that's something that, internally within the Sikh religion is, thought of in a very particular way as embodying certain religious ideas. And yet, in total contrast to that, the Mughal sources from the time are absolutely silent on it. They don't even mention it. It was that unexceptional to execute this Guru. And so we do have records of it from later, but not until a few decades afterward. And one thing that symbolized to me is that Aurangzeb, like all Mughal kings, did not tolerate threats to the state and its security, right? One can go so far as to say, and I do in the book, that Aurangzeb is absolutely obsessed with state security, right? And he does not offer leniency for people that he perceives as enemies of the state. So for somebody like Guru Tegh Bahadur, it didn't matter that he was a religious leader. It didn't matter that he had this sort of, spiritual sort of place in the minds of many people, right? He just executed him, right? Nothing was going to save the Guru, right? You sometimes get later stories, Aurangzeb offered he could convert to Islam, right? And I don't think that that's true. I don't think that converting to Islam would have saved this guy at all. The second he was captured by Mughal forces, he was a dead man. So, Aurangzeb was doing various things in those first 24 years, but then, of course, he made a very unconventional decision, which was to move south forever.
Yep. We come to this part now, and that's the fourth and final phase of Aurangzeb's life, and these are the 26 years that he spends in the Deccan. Here is man, we traditionally associate the fulcrum of power as being Delhi, and then suddenly one of the emperors moves south and remains in the Deccan for the next 26 years, until his death. It was said of by the biographer, Harold Nicholson, of the biographer of King George V, he said for 17 years, King George V did nothing at all but kill animals and stick in stamps. He had this huge collection of stamps, and that's all he did for 17 years. And he said, what do I do with a subject like that? What kind of a biography can I write of George V? For 17 years, he did nothing but stick in stamps. So what did Aurangzeb do for the 26 years that he was in the Deccan? Stick in stamps or
It's a great question. So Aurangzeb leaves Delhi in 1679, right? He goes over to Rajasthan. There's a sort of issue there with Mewar and Marwar. He deals with that. He gets to the Deccan in 1681, right? And he stays there until his death in 1707. So the Deccan, I sort of think of it in two phases, a short phase followed by a long phase. The short phase is the first 6 to 7 years, when Aurangzeb has amazing, unprecedented success from a Mughal perspective in the Deccan. Right? He does a brutal siege of the Muslim kingdom of Bijapur, followed by a brutal siege of the Muslim kingdom of Golconda, right? And both fall to Mughal power. The Mughals had thirsted after the Deccan. They had sought this, jewel in the crown of their empire, so to speak, for 100 years, right? Akbar wanted to conquer the Deccan. He had attacked these rulers. And Aurangzeb succeeded in his great-grandfather's, intentions, right, where they had fallen short. These sieges, I should mention, were highly controversial, right? You had one Muslim king attacking another Muslim king. During the siege of Bijapur, for example, there was a delegation of ulama from Bijapur that went to Aurangzeb, and they said, sir, how can you do this to us, right? I mean, the death toll was off the charts. About half of Bijapur's population was killed during the siege and a following epidemic. They said, how can you do this, right? We're Muslims. This is against Sharia. Aurangzeb, as far as I know, had absolutely no answer for them, except that he was a Mughal king, and Mughal kings needed no special justification to expand their empire by any means necessary, right? So Aurangzeb, he pushed through with these brutal sieges. He got Bijapur, he got Golconda. But after that, after 1687, the next, 20 years, he basically wanders around the Deccan, kind of hungering after heaps of stone, to quote Bhimsen Saxena, one of the chroniclers of this time. And it's really unclear to me exactly what Aurangzeb was thinking during this period of time. Looking back, with sort of hindsight, it seems like he didn't accomplish much, right? He sort of would get a fort here, get a fort there, sometimes through prolonged sieges that lasted for years, right? Anytime a siege lasts more than, a year or two, you have a problem, right? The siege is actually not a siege, something's getting in, okay? You had Mughal commanders not listening to him, so on and so forth. And in the end, when he dies in 1707, he has nominal control of this huge area of land, but it falls apart very quickly, right? So it seems like he didn't actually accomplish much in those last 20 years. Certainly towards the end, Aurangzeb was a very old man, right? He dies at the age of 88. He was quite sick during his final years, although he insisted on being carried about the decade, right? He did not just want to lay around in a fort, right? He wanted to be out on the battlefield. But looking back, something I say in the book that I'll repeat here is that I think if Aurangzeb had died 20 years earlier, right, and it had, the length of reign that Shah Jahan or Jahangir had, right, at 22 and 30 years respectively, that we would judge him rather differently. But those last 20 years of just wandering more or less aimlessly around the Deccan, sort of losing sight of his purpose, pushing as far south as Tamil Nadu at times, it seems like he had sort of gotten lost and forgotten that there is more to being a Mughal emperor than just conquering land. And that is part of his sort of tangled legacy that we now have to deal with.
Since we're talking about his legacy, we have to touch upon his bigotry or his alleged bigotry. The jizya tax, but the fact that he's imposed a tax. A bit louder. No problem.
On his bigotry, the jizya tax is such that he imposed on Hindus, which is then withdrawn when he's in the Deccan for part of the. But there is something which you've mentioned in the book, which I think is interesting, and that is a princely order that he issues to the Raj Singh of Mewar. And gives an insight into his open-mindedness. Because the persons of great kings are shadows of God, that men of various dispositions and different religions should live in the way of peace and pass their days in prosperity, and no one should meddle in the affairs of another. And anybody who can remember what the speech to the Constituent Assembly on the 11th of August 1947 will find a parallel in this particular paragraph. Then there's the question of destruction of states, and you've made a very interesting observation, destruction of temples. You made that it was always for the reasons of state. You mentioned it earlier, that there were executions, but because they were to uphold his authority, as it were. And you've quoted Easton, who says that in fact, only a dozen temples were destroyed in northern India, none in Dhaka, where he spent 20 years. So if he was such a zealot, then why was he not on a rampage all the time?
Right. So the thing about temple destruction, right, the sort of going theory in the popular imagination, especially in India, especially among the Hindu right, is that Aurangzeb destroyed Hindu temples because he hated Hindus, and he wanted them all to convert to Islam. So the problem with that logic is, if that was true, Aurangzeb had the power to destroy thousands of temples. He had the power to have a large-scale conversion program and to force many Hindus to convert to Islam at the point of a sword. So why didn't he? Because he didn't, right? We have right around a dozen confirmed temple destructions, fewer during his reign, fewer on his direct orders, right? Even if we assume there were some that were not recorded, we're talking about a few dozen, right? Not thousands. And so saying that Aurangzeb just hated Hindus, it doesn't add up, right? I cannot use that responsibly as a historian to explain his actions, right? So I have to come up with something else. And you start looking around, and I sort of adopt Richard Eaton's line here that a lot of this had to do with state interests, right? Now, in order to understand how you can destroy a temple to promote state interests, you do have to understand that Hindu temples were considered legitimate targets of punitive state action in Mughal India. This is very different than the modern world, right? In the modern world, to destroy a mosque or to bomb a temple, I mean, this is a sort of abhorrent thing that would be seen as a direct attack on religion and virtually nothing else. That's not how it was viewed in Mughal India, right? Temples held political authority, and so they could be targeted when their leaders or their associates participated in, say, a Zamindar rebellion against Aurangzeb. This happened in Benares at the Vishwanath temple. Or say when their leaders helped Shivaji escape from the Mughal court in 1666, right? This also happened in Benares and happened elsewhere as well. You know, the other thing that I point out in the book about Aurangzeb, let me say two things actually that I point out. One is that some of the more egregious charges against him vis-a-vis Hindus and his alleged bigotry are simply false. Okay, there was no large-scale conversion program. One way that we know that is that in the Akhbarat, the daily news reports that are sent to Aurangzeb's court, we have many of those today, those note who converted to Islam from Hinduism in various parts of the empire, usually in single-digit numbers, often given names. If you had a large-scale conversion program of thousands, you would not have that, right? Aurangzeb also did not commit a genocide of Hindus, all right? He killed many Hindus, do not get me wrong. He also killed many Muslims, all right? And he didn't kill them as Hindus or Muslims, but because it was in his state interest. The second thing I'll mention is that Aurangzeb's policies towards Hindus are complicated, and many of them were actually what we would now term positive, right? He increased the Hindu share in the Mughal nobility by more than 50%, right? That is no small feat. Hindus had remained very steady at about 20% of Mughal mansabdars through Akbar's reign, Jahangir's, and Shah Jahan's. By the end of Aurangzeb's reign, they're up to 35%, arguably causing considerable discord among other groups within the mansabdari system, right? Aurangzeb also, he resisted calls, and he did face calls from time to time to sort of restrict certain jobs to Muslims, or to give Muslims, particularly Sunni Muslims, some sort of preference, right, some sort of special place in the Mughal Empire. And he resisted that all the way into the end of his reign, you know, sort of saying, you know, you have your religion, I have mine, this is state business, right? We're all in that particular thing together. So I would not go so far as to say, of course, that, you know, Aurangzeb was some liberal, tolerant guy by modern standards, right? You know, this is the 21st century. Aurangzeb was a man of the 17th century. And we need to judge him by the standards of his day. Because to judge him by the standards of our day simply tells us nothing interesting about him.
Good. 1707, Aurangzeb falls ill, and he has a premonition of his death. And that premonition comes in a very odd way. His sister, Gauhar Begum, who in fact was the last child of Mumtaz Mahal, and whom, when Mumtaz Mahal was delivering, she died. So obviously there was perhaps a personal relationship between this elder brother and this infant child. She remains with him, and she dies just a few months before he does, and he regards that as a premonition of his death, which is rather interesting because George V had an unmarried sister called Victoria, and she also, 3 months before he died, when she died, he regarded that as a premonition of his own departure. So there was a kind of parallel in this. The succession, he prefers his grandsons to his sons, but it's beyond his control. And in 1707, when he dies, he's then buried in this very simple grave. There's an epitaph that he writes in his letter to his grandson, Badarbakht, where he says, in the region of Hindustan, this scrap of bread, i.e. the Mughal Empire, is a generous gift of their majesties Taimur and Akbar, meaning that we are part of a lineage. But on a more humane level, there is, I just want to share with you, is there any regret that he had for, when he was in the Deccan? Well, obviously about Dara Shikoh, and we'll come to that in a moment. But he also regrets not being able to get mangoes in the south. And it echoed something that Babur had said when he came from Farghana, and he said, you can't, India means, there's nothing in India. You can't even get a good musk melon here. And just the smell of it made him nostalgic. So, we move to the modern perception of Aurangzeb. Please, would you like to, and that is the impact of modern India's perception of Aurangzeb. Please. Very briefly, but then we'll throw it open for questions.
No, absolutely.
Right.
So you see here Aurangzeb Road in Delhi, which had been Aurangzeb Road for a number of decades, named so by the British. Aurangzeb Road was renamed in 2015. It is now APJ Abdul Kalam Road after India's 11th president, right? Basically, it's the displacement of a Muslim who is looked at as problematic with a Muslim who is looked at as less problematic, right? You know, the Hindu right has gained power in India, right? They're controlling India from a central government level, and Indian culture has changed a lot just in the last couple of years. India is rewriting textbooks, particularly in Rajasthan and Maharashtra, but elsewhere as well. They are taking out the Mughals. In some cases, they are simply lying about the Mughals. There's a textbook now in Rajasthan that says that Akbar lost the Battle of Haldi-Khati. He did not, he won it, right? It's hard to explain like the boundaries of the Mughal Empire if you do not understand who won that battle. And this is a big problem. Of all the Mughal kings, all right, of all the Mughal kings, your Hindutva people, your Hindu nationalists, by far have the biggest problems with Aurangzeb Alamgir, right? He is sort of the focal point of their hatred of the Indo-Muslim past, and by extension, Muslims in present-day India. They didn't pick Aurangzeb Alamgir out of a hat. They picked it essentially because the British picked it for them, okay? It was the colonialists, it was the British who decided to hold up Aurangzeb Alamgir as the most hated of the Mughal kings. The British did that to justify their own rule over India, right? How do you sell British colonialism, which was a horrific thing in most regards? One way you sell it is by saying, well, at least we're better than the guys who came before.
Successors.
And this was the guy, right? You know, modern-day Hindu nationalists have done away with that final step of colonial logic. They're not arguing for the return of the British, of course, but they have embraced everything else wholesale. This is a problem for the past, and it's a problem for the present, right? I will leave it to others to say more about the present and why it is an obvious problem for Muslims to increasingly not be welcomed and have their loyalties questioned in modern-day India. As a historian, I am, of course, also very deeply concerned with the past, right? I care about history, and I care about the accurate representation of history in and of itself, and to tell us who we are today and where we come from. And in that sense, my book has been very controversial in India, and I receive a lot of hate mail from Indian readers due to it. So it's been an interesting ride, but I hope that I have contributed something to what I hope is the beginning of a new debate on Aurangzeb Alamgir.
Audrey would be happy to answer questions, so can we kick off with somebody? Yeah, please here, and then I'll come to you. Yeah, David, please. Could you make it a question? We don't want to polemical about Hindu-Muslim relationships.
Thank you, Audrey, for this comprehensive overview. I would like to know your views about Aurangzeb's policy towards Shias, and that is not just about the Deccan kings, but the overall Shias community during the Mughal time.
Great question. Aurangzeb's relationship with Shias. So, this is complicated, and it seems to me so far, from what I know, that it sort of falls along two extremes. Aurangzeb, particularly as a prince in the last half of the 1650s, does persecute Shia communities with some vehemence, particularly in Gujarat, but perhaps elsewhere as well, right, the Bohras and certain other groups. It's hard to see if there were political motivations there. That argument can sort of be worked both ways. And the reason why I'm hedging on that is that there is some research that is sort of still in progress by other people and perhaps coming out on that question. So on the one hand, you do have, particularly early on, a persecution of Shias. On the other hand, there is a story that a sort of anecdote that I relate in the book from the 1680s, where a man from Bukhara approaches Aurangzeb and he says, you know, Aurangzeb, what is with all of these Shias in your administration, right? Like, this is not okay. Like, can we replace them with some, Sunni people? And Aurangzeb says, no, what is wrong with you, right? Like, the religious stuff, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in their ability to help me run the Mughal state. So you do tend to have these two sort of extremes. And to be honest, I think that this is an area that really requires more research. And I look forward to perhaps not doing it myself, but to seeing others do it.
Please, quick question.
Hello, ma'am. My question is, why Aurangzeb felt the need to declare Dara Shikoh as an apostate rather than a political rival and not other of his brothers?
It's a great question. Aurangzeb did not need to declare Dar Shikoh an apostate, right? All he needed was to say, I won the War of Succession off with his head, right? So why did he? I think there are a few things to note here. One is that not all of the Mughal sources mention the apostate bit. All right, some of them do, and some of them just say Aurangzeb won and he executed Dara. So it was not necessarily the single most important fact at the time, right? Some writers thought it was important to mention, but others did not. I think the other context that helps us understand that is that Aurangzeb came up with reasons for killing his other brother, Murad, as well, right? Aurangzeb sort of allied with Murad throughout the War of Succession, then he imprisoned him and executed him in 1661. He executed Murad allegedly for because Murad had ordered the execution of another guy several years earlier, and Aurangzeb said that was illegitimate, so Murad had committed murder, all right? He didn't need that reason either, and that was flimsy. That was even flimsier than the apostate bit. So it seemed that Aurangzeb preferred to justify killing his brothers, even though he didn't need to. To me, this is part of Aurangzeb's larger commitment to justice, right? That sort of is pervasive throughout his reign. And by justice, I do not mean justice in a 2018 sense, of course. I mean the Mughal ideas of justice, much of which we would reject today. But Aurangzeb was obsessed with justice, with both being just and particularly with being perceived as a just ruler. And I think that the apostate sentence helped with that goal.
Thank you, Audrey. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. Just picking up on that, and I assume the justice element is going to be part of your answer to my question. Given that Shah Jahan was ill, and given that the fact of the remaining father was sort of more of a problem, could there ever been any possibility that Aurangzeb would have done away with his father and just put it off to natural causes? It's just an interesting question that he allowed him to survive 7 years, whereas, he did get rid of his brothers. And I just wondered, did he indeed die of natural causes eventually?
So, as far as I know, Shah Jahan died of natural causes. I think if Aurangzeb had wanted to poison him secretly or something like that, he would not have waited 7.5 years. So I have no reason to doubt that part of the story. But why didn't Aurangzeb kill his father at the get-go? I think he would have faced too much opposition, right? The Mughals held on to their kingship, in part with a sort of iron hand, right? This was a brutal, violent era. We should not forget that. But they also held on to power by consensus, right? If everybody rebelled...
My question is, how would you...
They held on to power by consensus. And so if all the groups in the Mughal Empire, or even a significant number of them, had said, we're not going to support you anymore, right? You father, killing guy. We would have had a big problem, right? Keep in mind, even the Sharif of Mecca, right, the leader of Mecca, refused to recognize Aurangzeb as a legitimate Muslim king while Aurangzeb lived. Aurangzeb kept writing this guy letters. He kept sending him money to, support.
And also 2 copies of the Holy Quran that he'd written with his own hands.
Right, and the Sharif kept sending it back and saying, dude, you are not a king. You have locked up the king. So imagine if he had killed him, how bad that would have been. I think it would have threatened the very foundation of the
Absolutely. Regicide is a European practice. It's not on our side. Please.
Hi, Audrey. It's very nice to see you after a very long time. You were a dear of mine in the Columbia days, and for Professor Alison Bush's class. And so it's really nice to see you after such a long time and hear from you. My question is about the broader implications of Orientalist tropes, which I hear a lot in Pakistan in the post-colonial formation of the state, and the ideas that permeate in...
Question.
Yes, the question is, why is there so much, why do we have these Orientalist tropes that still survive decades after, after independence? Especially in India's case, it makes sense if they want to villainize Aurangzeb, but why isn't there greater nuance in Pakistani historical circles?
So why do we still have these Orientalist tropes? Because our present is unimaginable without the Orientalist past, right? Why are we speaking in English? Why are we in this sort of conference hall, right? Why do we have these kind of chairs, right? Why am I even here? I mean, you can't imagine our world without the Orientalists, and particularly with history. Modern history was invented by colonial era Europeans. That doesn't mean that they own it today. It doesn't mean that Europe owns history or anything, but it does mean that that is my legacy and it's your legacy. It's everyone's legacy equally. And so it's very hard to get out of that. I think a compounding factor is that there is justifiably a lot of anger about the colonial past, and that's completely understandable, and I empathize with that. Sometimes people follow on that by just denying it, right? I'm just going to reject the colonials. I'm just going to reject everything Western. And the problem is that doesn't work. You can't do that, right? It's part of who you are now, whether you want it to be or not. And so you have to work through it. That's the only way. But if you don't work through it and you just think you're rejecting it, then you just end up repeating it without even realizing it.
Apart from that, Aurangzeb perceived his policies in the interest of empire. But what do you see like reimposition of jizya and other towards Hindus majority? To which extent they contributed in the decline of Mughal Empire?
So this is the million-dollar question. What made the Mughal Empire fall apart? And I really wish I had an answer, but I don't. If anything, I'm more confused after writing this book than I was before. Part of why I'm confused is I don't know what sort of causes I'm looking for. Does an individual cause the fall of an empire? Can we blame Aurangzeb or Bahadur Shah, his successor, or whoever? Are they systemic causes? And if they are, which systems? Is it a financial issue? Is it stretching the army too thin? Is it a military issue? Is it a cultural issue? I don't even know where to begin looking for the causes of Mughal decline. And I think that decline in general is a question that has not been seriously studied sort of across the broad spectrum of history. So it's not just a Mughal problem, it's a wider history problem. I would, however, having said all of that about our lack of knowledge, I would caution against assuming that the jizya was the problem in particular. And that's because it's unclear that the jizya tax was ever very effective, right? Aurangzeb institutes the jizya, goes on for a couple of decades, but throughout that he remits it for huge portions of the empire, including the entire Deccan in 1704. It's unclear the jizya was ever imposed on the Deccan again, right? We have incomplete records of the finances from that period. Even when the jizya was collected, it's unclear that it ever got into the Mughal treasury, right? There are a lot of mentions in the sources about corrupt ulama going around and, doing what they want with the jizya money. That was probably not good for the empire, but it's not like the empire was completely uncorrupt until Aurangzeb, right? I mean, corruption was a sort of persistent feature. So I want to know what caused the decline of the Mughal Empire as much as everyone else, but I think that we need to back up and consider what causes we're even looking for, right? Can a single tax really topple what was the most powerful, richest dynasty of its day, or do we need a sort of broader-based explanation?
Good. Amadit, do you have a question? Briefly, so that we can wind up. Thanks.
Hi, Audrey. I just wondered, you mentioned about you receiving challenging emails in India. So have you been invited to platforms to speak there, and what have been your experiences, if you have been?
That's an excellent question. So I have been invited back to India a couple of times since my Aurangzeb book. Owing to personal reasons and family things, obligations, I have not been able to accept those invitations. So my knowledge of the Indian reception of my book has been mainly through social media at this point. Obviously, Twitter is a particularly vicious platform. I also do get emails, I get Facebook messages, the occasional phone call even. And I should note that while the most vehement opposition comes from within India, so far as I can tell, I live in New Jersey, which is home to a large Indian origin and Pakistani origin population, and I hear from Indian Americans as well who are unhappy about my book. So there is a US-based response there as well. I think what is most upsetting to me, it's not necessarily the personal attacks. Those are unpleasant. Nobody likes to be attacked in vicious language. But what is most upsetting to me as a historian is that in the attacks on me, what's getting lost is the history, the past. No one's learning about Aurangzeb Alamgir, right? And that is my goal, right? Contrary to the beliefs of Hindu nationalists who attack me, I have no agenda vis-a-vis modern-day India and Pakistan, right? I am a historian whose work was, to be honest, almost completely inconsequential until about 5 years ago when Hindu nationalism sort of started exploding again, and suddenly my work became relevant. My hope is that in all of the political, mess, that some people would take seriously the history, right, and bother to learn about these people, that some of the spotlight can be redirected back to the Mughal period.
Okay. Just before we take the last question, perhaps, Audrey, you might like to rename your book and call it The Royal Fundamentalist, rather than The Reluctant Fundamentalist. Please.
I'll consider that for the next edition.
Last question, please, madam.
Welcome to Lahore. I just wanted to say, could you give us a little bit more on his relationships with the women in his life? Wives, sisters, concubines, etc.
The women in his life. This is an excellent question. So I have been accused from time to time, not unjustly, of having a sort of blind spot when it comes to women in the Mughal period. Right, like I was saying, we all reproduce Orientalist tropes, right? We sometimes reproduce sexist tropes as well. And Mughal histories are incredibly sexist. They don't tend to mention women all that often, right? Men are much more present. And I am perhaps guilty of reproducing the biases of my sources in that regard, and I endeavor to improve on that front. That said, because the sources don't talk all that much about women, it can be hard. It can be really hard to get back at it, right? You have to do a lot of historical legwork, read between the lines, read against the grain of the text to kind of recover this. I can tell you that Aurangzeb did have relationships with various sisters, right, and that those changed over time. And he had relationships with various wives and other women, romantic relationships as well. So this was an important part of his reign, and I look forward to it coming out further in possibly my future work and hopefully the work of others as well.
Wonderful. Can I just conclude by showing you a picture which Audrey has included in her book, which is of the coronation of, ostensibly the coronation of Aurangzeb. This was what was described as the coronation by Dr. Aijazuddin. The painting is in the Freer Gallery in Washington. My reason for showing it to you is that I was asked to comment on this and analyze it. This and another painting of Jahangir by Bishiter, in which he's shown the King James I and the Sultan of Turkey. But the reason for discussing this with you is Dr. Aijazuddin described it as being of his coronation, and it showed a time when he was interested in music, which he was, by the way, and therefore the veena in the foreground is symbolic of it, and. So I then looked at the painting very carefully, and I'm going to indulge that with you as well. If you expand the picture, if I blow it up like this, you're going to see something which is, sorry, I can't seem to find the point on this. Anyway, Aurangzeb is on the left, standard portrait, man sitting on his right, a prince. But then if you look carefully, the drawing of the carpet goes through the figure on the right-hand side. So obviously, the figure on the right had been overpainted some time later. The original composition was just of those two. And a figure is then included whenever, probably 50 years afterwards. And the veena you'll see is just an add-on. The angle is wrong for it to have been part, because if you look at the pandan and the sword, etc., they're all perfectly straightforward, but not the veena. Somebody had just added the veena because they thought of Mughal, he'd given up his music, abjured music, etc., so put it in. What I'm trying to say here is, and this was the argument that I used, that it is important with paintings that you should not just look at them, but you should see them. And that is what I regard as the value of Audrey's book, because what she makes us do is not just look at Aurangzeb, but actually to see the man behind the myth. So thank you very much indeed, Audrey, for a very stimulating